In this video, we're going to cover a question that pops up frequently. Is it better to have an odd number of members on a board or committee? I say this question pops up frequently, but actually, it's usually not a question. Often there's a very confident member who states as a fact that you need an odd number of members on a committee. Is this true? Is it a fact? Well, they say this because they figure that if you have, for example, 8 members on a committee, you might have 4 voting in favor and 4 voting against. And they figure this creates some sort of deadlock in the meeting that can't be fixed. And they're quick to point out that if you had an odd number of members, this could never happen because you would have an additional member whose vote would magically break the tie. But don't be fooled by this. There are some big problems with this logic, which we will cover right now. First, there's nothing wrong with a tie vote in a committee or board or in any meeting for that matter. A tie does not create a problem that needs to be fixed. A motion that requires a majority vote to be adopted must receive more votes in favor than against. So if a vote results in a tie, the motion didn't receive more votes in favor, so the motion is simply lost. There's no need to break the tie or do anything further with the motion. A motion that receives 4 votes in favor and 4 votes against is just as lost as a motion that receives 0 votes in favor and 8 votes against. With the vote that receives 4 in favor and 4 against, if we were to add that 9th member to make it an odd number of voters, we would have to keep in mind that if this new member votes against the motion is still lost. And adding this member's vote has done nothing to affect the outcome. The motion was lost when it was a tie, and the motion is still lost now that it's 4 in favor and 5 against. On the other hand, if the new member voted in favor, the outcome would change. It would be 5 in favor and 4 against. But all we have done is change a motion from being lost to being adopted. So yes, if you create a committee with an odd number of members, theoretically, on those occasions where the vote is so close that it would have actually ended in a tie with an even number of members, then adding an additional member to make it an odd number would, hypothetically, change the outcome of the vote in half of those cases. Meaning that half the time the motion would be lost and half the time the motion would be adopted. But don't let that fool you either. Even though adding a 9th member to give the board or committee an odd number of members would hypothetically change the outcome of a tied vote in half of those cases, the exact same thing is true of adding a 10th member to give the board or committee an even number of members. Because theoretically, this member would vote in favor of the motion half the time, in which case the outcome wouldn't change, but this member would vote against the motion the other half of the time, changing the effect of the vote and causing the motion to go from being adopted to being lost. So we see that when it comes to affecting the vote, what's good for the odds is good for the evens, and there is no benefit having an odd number or an even number. And keep in mind that most of the time the vote is not close enough where having an odd or even number of members would affect the outcome. But in those cases where it is that close, choosing to have an odd or an even number of members will each affect the vote equally, which is to say that each would change the outcome half the time, and the other times each would have no effect on the outcome. Now, there are times, such as when appointing someone to a position or determining the location of a certain event, when a tie means that you haven't determined a result that needs to be determined. In these cases, you would have to vote again, possibly with new choices added to the mix, and you would have to keep voting as many times as necessary for one choice to actually receive a majority of the votes cast. But when someone tells you that this is a reason to have an odd number of members on a board or committee, keep in mind that they're overlooking 2 important factors: absentees and abstentions. First, with absentees, we must understand that every board or committee member is not going to be able to attend every meeting. That's an accepted fact in parliamentary law. Appointing 9 members to a committee doesn't ensure that you will have 9 members at every meeting. That isn't even a reasonable expectation in most organizations. So if you have an odd number of members on the board or committee, let's say 9, and if 1 or 3 are absent from any particular meeting, then you will have an even number present at the meeting, and if every member votes, you have the possibility of having a tie. which, once again, is not a problem at all. It simply means the motion is lost. However, not every member has to vote, and that brings us to the second point to consider. A member has the right to abstain, so even if every member is in attendance, having an odd number of total members doesn't mean an odd number of votes will be cast on any particular motion. Robert's Rules of Order provides that, although it is the duty of every member who has an opinion on a question to express it by his vote, he can abstain since he cannot be compelled to vote. So, when it comes to voting, there are simply too many complex variables to say that it is better to have an odd or an even number of members on a board or committee. From meeting to meeting and from vote to vote, all of these factors are going to change. And even if you thought odd or even was better on one vote inside one meeting, it doesn't mean you'll feel the same way on another vote in another meeting, because the circumstances won't be the same. Now, there is one area where the odd or even factor does have a consistent effect. That is on the quorum. Let's take a look. Let's say the quorum is set at a majority of the members, which is the standard and most common quorum requirement for boards and committees. And let's say we have a committee with 8 members on it. Since the quorum is set at a majority of the members on the committee, the quorum would be anything over 4, since 4 is half, and majority means more than half. So 4 would not be enough, but anything over 4 is sufficient. Technically, 4.1 members would satisfy the quorum requirement, or even 4.01 for that matter. But since we can't have a fraction of a member attending a meeting, the practical effect is that we have to deal in terms of whole members. So we would need 5 members at the meeting to satisfy the quorum requirement. As a quick caveat here, let me just point out that some organizations use fractional voting, in which case it is possible for a fraction of a vote to be present at a meeting, and in those cases, sometimes the quorum is based on the number of votes present as opposed to the actual number of members present. But fractional voting is not very common, and it is especially rare in boards and committees. So for the examples in this video, we're going to focus on the standard situation where each member of the board or committee has 1 vote. So, turning back to our example, if we were to raise the total number of members on the committee to 9, meaning that we add 1 additional member to make it an odd number, we would still need 5 members to satisfy the quorum. How can that be? Well, majority means more than half. More than half of 9 equals anything over 4.5. When we are dealing with whole members, anything over 4 and anything over 4.5 are the same from a practical standpoint. They both clearly indicate that 4 is not enough, but 5 is. So let's look at our committee of 8 members again. And we see that we need 5 members to attend to satisfy the quorum requirement, represented in green here. If we increase the number of members on the committee to 9, making it an odd number, we see that we still need 5 members for a quorum. That number hasn't changed. However, we have increased the number of members who can be absent from the meeting. When we have 9 members on the committee, 4 can be absent, represented here in red. That's 1 more than when the committee had 8 members. If we increase the number of members on the committee again to 10 to make it an even number, we see that the number of members needed to satisfy the quorum requirement is increased by 1 member, moving it from 5 to 6, since a majority of 10 is anything over 5, meaning that 5 is no longer sufficient, but anything over 5 is. However, the number of members who can be absent hasn't changed. That's still at 4. And this happens consistently when we move up from an odd number to a higher even number, and the reverse happens when we move up from an even number to a higher odd number. So, to recap, when the quorum is set at a majority, increasing from an even number of members, such as 8, to the next higher number, such as 9 in this case, the number of members needed to satisfy the quorum requirement stays the same, but the number of members who can be absent increases by 1. And if you increase from an odd number, such as 9 here, to the next higher even number, which would be 10 in this case, we see that the number required to be present will increase by 1, but the number who can be absent from the meeting while still obtaining a quorum stays the same, in this case 4, just the same as when we had 9 members on the board or committee. So, does this indicate that a board or committee is better off with an even or odd number of members? No, one is not better than the other. There really isn't a better. It's up to each organization to decide when it's determining the composition of the board or committee. Different numbers are going to work better for different organizations in different situations. It's just helpful for the organization to understand that the even or odd factor doesn't have a meaningful effect on the vote, but it can have an effect on the application of the quorum, especially with smaller boards or committees. In conclusion, the idea that an odd number of members is better may seem to have some merit at first glance, but upon further analysis, we see that it is simply another parliamentary myth. Many factors go into determining the optimal composition of a board or committee, the very least of which is whether the number is odd or even. I recommend not getting stuck on this point and focusing instead on the many other concerns, such as not making the board or committee so large that it's difficult to fill with members who are willing and able to serve, and also not making it so small that members will feel overwhelmed by the workload. And of course, more important than the number of members is the actual members themselves. Careful selection of the members who will serve on a board or committee is the best ingredient for success. Now, I know you may be saying, but we have a 6-member board and they're always split, 3 on one side and 3 on the other, and they never get anything done. Well, if the board isn't getting anything done, you shouldn't try to fix the problem mathematically by adding another member to a dysfunctional board. First, the board is a deliberative assembly that is supposed to be finding solutions to problems. If the board needs to hire a landscaping company, for example, and the board members are split on which company to hire, the board has a responsibility to find a solution. In many cases, that will mean finding a compromise that a majority of the board members can support, which may mean finding an alternate landscaping company that is not the favorite of either side, but that can come in and finally mow the grass. It just doesn't make sense for members to see the lawn in disrepair and automatically think, this board is letting us down. We need to add another member to make it an odd number. So, don't blame the numbers. Instead, hold the board accountable. If the board members are unwilling to accept their responsibility to find solutions despite their differences, you don't need a different number of board members. You need different board members. Second, there's no guarantee that adding another position to a dysfunctional board will make that board successful. You might just be creating a 3-way deadlock on which landscaping company to hire. A better solution would be to provide the board with training on how to be efficient and effective in its meetings. That covers the very interesting question of, is an odd number of members better?